That was an awesome introduction. The talk won't be nearly as good. It's really a pleasure to be back here. I really did mean the part, I actually meant all of that, but the part about OKR being a really special place where the faculty really are, take their mission of professionalization very seriously, where I did feel that you guys did a terrific job of kind of getting us ready for junior faculty positions and not treating us so much like students, and that isn't the case in a lot of other places. I do my best to emulate that. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks for inviting me to this seminar. It's a little bit different from the typical seminar that I give, where I'm usually talking about one specific paper and one set of analyses, whereas this is more of a summary of a lot of work that I've been doing over the last several years, focused on this Vietnamese enclave in New Orleans, where I live now. It's a little bit of a convoluted story. There's lots of chapters to it. So if we could hold the questions and comments until the end, I'm going to try to move pretty quickly so we have plenty of time for discussion. The first chapter of this story actually began here. About 11 years ago, almost to the day, I was here in this same seminar room giving a talk about the Vietnamese community in New Orleans, though at that time I was just starting my data collection for that part of the study. I was very interested in what becomes of immigrants when they move to the U.S., especially from Vietnam, because there was a lot of really special circumstances for that wave of immigrants. The collapse of South Vietnam in 1975. There was a lot of repatriation back to Vietnam for people who were not admitted to the U.S., and so it kind of gave me a bit of an angle on selection effects, which is what I was really interested in. That's a story for another day. And it's detailed on this website. There's a link to it there if you're curious how that turned out. But no one could have anticipated, I certainly couldn't, that the next chapter of that story was going to occur just a few months after I was here giving that talk. My students and I were just getting ready to go into the field to collect the U.S. part of that study and to try to survey how Vietnamese immigrants in the U.S., in New Orleans in particular, were doing after having lived there for a period of time. We had just collected the data for that study in June and July of 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit at the end of August 2005. And so after we dried off and focused on our own set of problems, my doctoral student at the time, Ben Tron, and I realized pretty quickly that there was really a terrific opportunity here because we had pre-exposure measures of this Vietnamese population before their community was flooded by a major disaster. And so that got us really interested in kind of pre and post measures of disaster in general, but in particular, it gave us an opportunity to focus on how an immigrant group might fare after a disaster. And as we started exploring this, it became really clear that there wasn't a lot known about this question for a couple of reasons. First, immigrants tend to fly under the radar. They're pretty quiet. They kind of don't like to be noticed. They're not generally very politically active, and so unfortunately, a lot of people don't pay very much attention to them. The second part of the reason why we don't know a lot about the answer to this question is because, and that's not just for immigrants, but for everybody else, disasters by their very nature are unpredictable events. We don't know when they're going to occur, so having pre-exposure data is pretty unusual. And that's really important for immigrants because they often tend to settle in sections of cities that are a bit marginal, low-lying, prone to flooding and other calamities, and so they may actually have a lot more of an impact than some other groups. That's what I just said. So, in that first year after Katrina, this is another doctoral student, Lung Vu, and I, who is Vietnamese, made an effort to try to pull together some funds to see if we could locate and re-interview these original 125 families that we interviewed just before Katrina occurred. We were successful in locating about 2/3 of them that first year. And as we were doing the field work in the late summer and early fall of 2006 for this first round of data collection, I began to be really impressed by some of the stories and some of the answers that people were giving in these interviews. I remember this guy in particular So this was probably in October of 2006. We had a really hard time catching him because he was working double shifts at Sara Lee. Wages were really high. He was, his family, was displaced. They were in North Carolina as he was rebuilding their home. I was really struggling with a lot of anger, disappointment. Had lawsuits against both of my insurance companies. My contractor taking all my money and not repairing my house. He eventually did. But I was fighting a lot of battles on several fronts, losing most of them. My wife was a journalist for the Picayune at the time. She was in the city when everything flooded, and it just utter chaos, and she was still struggling with sleep and some issues from that. So we were not doing so well at this period in the recovery. This guy was completely different. He had the same set of problems. The same insurance companies were completely ripping him off. They were paying him 35 cents on the dollar, like they were for everyone else. His family was displaced. He was doing all the work himself, just working like a crazy guy, and he was just as happy as could be. He never expected the insurance companies to pay. He was happy with what he got. He kept saying, "I can't believe it. They paid me $15,000. I'm going, you got to fight them. I mean, you easily got $50,000 worth of damage there." He said, "Are you kidding? It's $15,000. It only cost me $5,000 to buy the material. I had some savings. My friends and I did all the work myself. I made $10,000 out of it. I started a new business. He was just everything was upbeat and on top of the world." I still think he should have sued his insurance companies, but it started to really change my perspective a little bit about what was going on and how somebody might respond to this calamity that I was kind of wallowing in. Whereas he, and not just he, it became really clear as we started to analyze the data from this first post-Katrina wave that he was not unusual, that people in the community were generally faring quite well, a lot better than everybody else, especially me. And so then the question that I sought to answer was, once I started to get some more statistical data that described the population, I became more and more convinced that it was an anomaly, that lots of other people were doing well too. I wanted to know why. What was it about the Vietnamese that might have given them a leg up in the recovery after Katrina? So what I'm going to do for the time here is I'm going to tell you a bit about how I went about pursuing the answer to this question. I'm going to review fairly quickly. There's a lot of published papers that give a lot more detail about this. I'm going to give you some highlights of some of the evidence that suggests to me at least that they are doing really well. I'm going to talk a bit about the literatures of disaster studies, immigration studies, and sociology that I think will kind of give us some leverage or some insights into answering this question. I'm going to provide a framework for attacking it, and then in the end, show you some of my evidence about it that suggests to me that both culture and some other factors have a lot to do with the answer to that question. It's definitely a mixed method approach. The evidence for that I'm going to show that suggests, at least to me, that the Vietnamese were doing a lot better than other groups is largely statistical and based on this happy accident that we had this pre and post survey of the community before and after Katrina. And we don't have a lot of information on other populations, but other people do, using a lot of the same measures. And then we have a lot of qualitative data too. We did a lot of extensive interviews with community leaders, priests, physicians, heads of CBOs, business leaders throughout the community to ask them about what was working well and what wasn't. And I draw on that a lot for the latter part of the talk. And then I also draw upon the literature, these various literatures that I had a very good fortune to spend the last couple of years. 2 years ago, I took the Russell Sage Foundation on a fellowship to explore this. And so I spent a lot of that period reading on disasters, which I knew little to nothing about, culture, which even less. And so these literatures have also been an important part of my approach to answering these questions. So, the precursor study, I've told you a bit about that, where my colleagues and I wanted to look at Vietnamese that remained behind in Vietnam, those who got as far as Philippines or Hong Kong and were repatriated back, and those who ended up here. The important point of that is that the data collection occurred just before Katrina, as I said. The other important part is also in yellow on this one, since we were really interested in assessing how people might fare after a disaster, we were really lucky that a lot of the measures that we asked to see how they were doing as a result of their immigration experience were very relevant to what we wanted to do too. A lot of measures on employment, mental health, physical health, social networks, things like that were also well suited to what we wanted to do. So that was all a lucky accident. In addition to the T0 wave, which is before Katrina, we re-interviewed them at 1 year after, 2 years after, 5 years after, and we're going to go into the field this year to kind of do one more wave of their long-term recovery, comparing it to some other groups. That we also have some funding to explore. I also draw pretty heavily on this Displaced New Orleans Residents Survey that was done by one of my classmates at Princeton, Ryan Sastry, leads that. They have a fair amount of cases in New Orleans East where the Vietnamese reside. And then this Gulf Coast and Family Health Survey by my colleague David Abramson, who's now in NYU, also has a lot of data in New Orleans East that focuses on the non-Vietnamese out there. But I rely really heavily on these key informant interviews. There were 22 of them. I have some material on African American community leaders. I draw a bit on that. And then we have some intergenerational interviews that include first and second generation at the elderly working age and adolescent groups as well. So really extensive qualitative as well as statistical data. Okay, so this is a picture of flooded New Orleans just a few days after Katrina hit on August 29, 2005. You can see that about 80% of the city flooded. This is the French Quarter stayed dry, Garden District stayed dry. Everything kind of along the riverbanks that has higher elevation stayed dry. But the middle part, the residential parts of the city, all flooded to a depth of, my house had about 3 feet. It got to about 12 to 15 feet in this section of the city. This is New Orleans East. It's almost all African American, working, and middle class, except for one small community out here, which is the Vietnamese community. And then it really jumps out here. You can see this is a census map. I don't know why I did it in red. But the red is the Vietnamese enclave out here in the corner. Almost everybody else out there is African American. It all flooded 1 to 3 feet in that section of the city. This is a house in the community. It's actually in the Vietnamese section of New Orleans East, but all through that area of the city, it was pretty much the same. It's pretty recent housing. This one was probably built in the 1960s, all built on slabs. The flood wasn't catastrophic like it was in the lower Ninth Ward where the levees collapsed, and then you had the tsunami wave that knocked everything down. It more kind of came up slowly and then went down slowly. But it was still very damaging. Houses like this, they probably cost about $100,000 to $125,000, and the median damage level was about $50,000 to $60,000. So you can see that National Guard has been here to kind of check for dogs, make sure that nobody's in the house. Heavy equipment's been in to kind of carry away the floors and the ceiling and the sheetrock inside, which revolved and eaten up with mold. Cars going to have to be replaced. And it flooded. This is kind of a typical house from the outside. This is what they would look like on the inside because the water sat in all the houses, for about sometimes a week or two before it went out. And it was really hot and humid during the period. It was the mold, that really did the most damage. So everything. This is why everything was so expensive to repair, because the insides of the houses became unusable. So this is also pretty typical of that area. So with that background and restatement of my question, I'm now going to review briefly the evidence that leads me to conclude that I think the Vietnamese are doing a lot better than other groups. So let me go through most of that for you. So in other words, I want to focus on the last part of my question, the so well part, because disaster researchers spend a lot of time looking at recovery, how to measure it, and then also how to compare groups that are doing well with other groups or other individuals who are not doing so well. I'm very fortunate that my colleague David Abramson, the same guy that I mentioned before, who's now at NYU, has one of the most highly regarded conceptual frameworks of what recovery is. And it is, as you kind of go through the dimensions, it makes good intuitive sense the other frameworks are very similar to it. If you wanted to assess how people were doing after a disaster, you would look at things like how stable is their housing, how are they doing physically, in terms of their health physically and mentally, how are they doing economically, and then how about their social role adaptation. So he doesn't use these 5 measures, and these are the ones that I focus on as I kind of work through the Vietnamese. So regarding for housing stability, what I've decided to use is how did people end up back home? What percentage of people came back to where they lived before? And so these the red line and the blue line come from a paper by Beth Fussell, Narayan Sastry, and myself, where we look at rates of return between blacks and whites. And the point of that paper was to show that blacks who were in red here came back at a much slower rate, and even 1 year after after Katrina, there were less than half had returned. This is just the survival curves from a life table. Less than half had come back. Whites were much more, came back at a brisker pace, and at the 1 year mark, about 70% were back. And so on this, I superimposed the same measure for the Vietnamese. You can see that it really kind of blows both groups out of the water. I mean, they kind of started off a little bit more slowly, but they came back in much higher percentages than everybody else. And so by the 1 year anniversary, almost 90% of the Vietnamese were back in their community. So that's a measure of housing stability. For mental health, there's none of what I'm talking about in terms of the measures are perfect. You kind of do the best you can with imperfect data. One, I think, to me at least, intriguing finding was that these population-based studies, Kessler, for example, a big study, that are looking at PTSD throughout the city, find that in areas that were flooded, about 1/3 of people had some indication of PTSD about a year after the storm. So they were exposed to something very traumatic, and it was still bothering them. For the Vietnamese, I worked with Fran Norris, who's an expert in post-disaster PTSD. We found that less than 5% of the Vietnamese suffered from this. So much lower levels of PTSD. That comparison is not great because the level of flooding, the level of trauma that different groups had in different parts of the city were really different. Again, Lower Ninth Ward, where houses collapsed and lots of people drowned. Hundreds of people drowned there. Very different from having to go out to the Superdome, being maybe inconvenienced and having to kind of wallow through mud and stuff to work on your own. Kind of very different scenarios. So I think a better comparison would be to compare the Vietnamese with their neighbors out in New Orleans East who had the same level of flooding, same type of household, same socioeconomic status, and those sorts of things. And that's what I do here. So this is using a measure that I like a lot called there's an SF36, short form 36, and short form, I use the short form 12 here because David Abramson and his colleagues who had a lot of respondents in New Orleans East who were African American in the adjoining zip codes to where the Vietnamese community was, they use the same thing. So I've got the same measures. People are living right next to each other. Everything is similar in their experience, level of flooding, housing, and all that, except that ethnicity is the only thing that really changes. And so so those are kind of natural controls, and I've got limited power because I've got pretty small sample sizes for both groups. So we've modeled it several ways, including marital status, home ownership, age and sex, and it always turns out to be right on the cusp of a significant 5-point advantage if you're Vietnamese. This is 2 years after the storm, compared to African Americans who experience the same thing. So a significant difference in mental status.
Yeah, just quickly ask, these are only the returnees, correct?
Yes.
Those who did not return were not included into that. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes. Well, for the Vietnamese, it would be the people who returned, but that's most of them. For the African Americans, these would be people whether they returned or not. So this would be based on their residence at the time of the trip. So it's not perfect because the African Americans ended up in FEMA housing. That was the drawing of the sample, whereas the Vietnamese Americans, it's a representative sample of first generation working age Vietnamese who spent a significant amount of time in Vietnam as well as the U.S. The reason why there's this funny sampling scheme is that's why we're interested in, for the original sample. Yes?
Intuitively, how would you explain a 5-point difference between the two groups? What would this
In terms of the substantive outcome?
Yeah.
It's kind of big. So this measure, the mean is 50, goes from 0 to 100. The mean is 50, standard deviation is 10. 10 is, it's kind of subjective, but people use this say 10 is a really big difference that would have some clinical significance to it. 5 less so, but for me at least it's interesting. Another component of these measures of recovery are social role adaptation. And I find this one really interesting because when I first started working in the community, it was a really sleepy, quiet community, kind of marginalized, way out, in the corner of New Orleans East. Everybody knew that they were out there, but there wasn't a whole lot of contact with them. When I wanted to do my first study, I had a lot of trouble finding a community-based organization to help me, recruit people in, contact them. There was this one small CBO that was doing like Vietnamese language and helping people with tax returns and things like that. All that changed after Katrina. There was an explosion in the development of new community-based organizations that were helping in the recovery, helping to administer funds, and organizing the community. So the city, state, and federal government tried to put a toxic waste dump just on the other side of the levee to where they were living that was going to probably get into their water table. And the Vietnamese very quickly mobilized to get everybody out there with signs and chants and everything to drive them off, and they won. They actually mobilized and shut down this big FEMA dump out there that everybody was really, when it first started going, there's no way they're going to win this battle, and they're done. Shut it down, and they kick off. Also, in 3 years after after Katrina, our congressman went to jail. Dollar Bill Jefferson was under federal investigation. He ended up going to federal prison. That seat became open, and so Joseph Gao ran for the seat, first Vietnamese American member of Congress out of a community of 10 to 12,000, in New Orleans, Vietnamese in the area. Southern California has about 700,000 Vietnamese Americans. They've been trying for decades to try to get a member in Congress. This small group effectively organized to get this guy in right after Katrina. He was just a one-termer. He's Republican too, so this was the first time that seat went Republican since the 1880s. And so, because it's been ever since New Orleans. So it was one term. The Democrats kind of reconfigured and took the seat back. But still, I thought it was a pretty amazing accomplishment. So that's just some highlights of it. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'd be curious to kind of hear what you think of it. But to me, at least, the kind of big, in the aggregate, all these measures kind of tell me there's something going on here. It's like they're actually doing really well. So the next thing that I wanted to do is explore the question, why that might be, and draw upon some of these literatures, some of which you'll be very familiar with. I spent very much time on the epidemiological paradox and things like that. So I think it's really relevant, so I'll just mention it. First example, words about resilience. So, as disasters, this was all new to me. I never really thought about disasters until Katrina, and didn't really get to study it until I had that great opportunity to be at Russell Sage for the year. So, the major paradigm in disaster studies that seeks to explain why some communities might do better than others, why some might recover better than others, focus on this paradigm called resilience. And there's a number of models. I like Frank Norris's model, but they're all quite similar and have similar sorts of dimensions. And so, first of all, by resilience, what they mean is how a community, or kind of the capacity of a community to bounce back from a setback like Katrina. So you can read the definition. 4 different dimensions to it. There are economic components, social networks, flow of information, and then this is kind of vague, but they call it community competence. I think they're really talking about human capital and expertise and things like that. As I was reading through this, I was a little surprised and a little disappointed that none of these paradigms or these frameworks of resilience really had anything to say about aspects of social glue that might distinguish one community from another. They had the social networks, but in terms of belief structures or history or where they came from, and how that might actually be part of the whole resilience package, nobody. It's almost deafening, the silence, that is involved in these discussions. I'm pretty sure the reason why is that I think a lot of social scientists, in fact I know a lot of social scientists, are still really skittish about invoking culture because of the cultural wars of the 1960s and 1970s, when after Moynihan's culture of poverty, and there was a lot of feeling among social scientists that we didn't want to use that because it was just sort of a way to blame people who were not doing well for their own problems. So I think there's still a real aversion throughout the social sciences to invoke culture as an explanation for anything, and I really get this sense I'm a disaster researcher. But for me, since I was really interested in this Vietnamese community that was kind of surrounded by this not very poor, not very affluent African American community that was functioning okay. Not a whole lot of poverty, housing was modest, but but these are kind of working class, middle class, same housing stock, and yet one's doing better than the other. I think there's no getting away. I've got ethnicity, but what is it about ethnicity that might be driving the difference? I think there's no getting away from really kind of grappling with this idea of culture. And so that's what I decided to do, because I'm really interested in what it might be. I'm interested in what sort of advantages an immigrant might have, but I'm really more interested in what sort of advantage a Vietnamese immigrant might have. Okay, well, let's talk about immigrants first. So you know about the epidemiological paradox, where a lot of immigrants and their children do better than you expect, given levels of poverty when they come to the U.S. And there's a lot of explanation for that. Selection is one of the big ones, that people who come to a place like the U.S. are going to be high tolerance for risk, they'll get on type of personality. The sick are not going to undergo the rigors of that sort of a trip. They're not a random sample of the population. So that's really important here, in ways that I'll talk about a bit later. So you know all the usual suspects in this, and I think this is definitely part of the story. The Vietnamese are very typical of other immigrants in the sense that they come with a lot of advantages, even before they get here. But I'm interested in more than that. If I could have just, been the puppeteer and designed the perfect experience, I would have had the Vietnamese, in one spot. I would have seen Katrina coming and done collected some pre-Katrina data of the African American community. Maybe I would have dropped in, some Guatemalans there too, of course I don't, so I have to deal with what I've got. But I still, really have this deep sense that there's something about the Vietnamese, in addition to being an immigrant, that may have given them some advantages, and that's what I'm really interested in. And of course, I'm talking about culture here. So, this project is actually a booklet work that I'm wrapping up, this spring. And one of the long chapters in the book is this history of culture in the social sciences, and what people mean by house evolve as a term. And I'm not going to go through that here. I'm just going to fast forward to the present, and give you this kind of working definition of what most anthropologists and social scientists and I mean when I talk about culture. It's about the beliefs, values, and shared understandings that a group of people will use to make the world meaningful to them. And these meanings are, of course, constructive and not essential. People think that dynamically change in response to different historical events like Katrina will sort of change the way that the Vietnamese view that world. So this kind of story about how this community came about for the Vietnamese is really interesting. I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm going to give you a sense of where they came from. So there's several small communities of Vietnamese spread throughout the New Orleans metro area. But the main one is what I showed you on that census map. That's kind of ground zero for it in that corner of New Orleans East, where they're very highly concentrated. They came in the summer of 1975. They were one of the first established Vietnamese communities in the U.S. The first wave, when Saigon collapsed in April of 1975, there was an air raid. military and bureaucratic establishment that were taken out to Guam, and then most of them went to a place in Missouri. I'll put the name in a second. And there they were. And people were trying to figure out where to put them. So the archdiocese, a lot of them were Catholic. Let me start with that. So Vietnam is a French colony. Catholicism, spread pretty rapidly when the French colonized it, especially in the north. And this is a really famous cathedral about 100 miles south of Hanoi called Bat Siem is the name of the place. And what I find remarkable about it is you've got kind of the big stout Gothic, French cathedral aspects of it, and the kind of crazy Asian flourishes as they kind of adapt it to for their own needs. So the Catholics were concentrated in the northern part of Vietnam. In 1954, there was an accord that split Vietnam into north and south. And the north went communist, the south went Catholics, I guess is the best word. And the Catholics were afraid that they were persecuted by the communists. So there was about 1 million Vietnamese Catholics who picked up and moved to the south in 1954. And they were very important. It's only about 10% of the overall population, but they're very disproportionately represented in government. Diem, the prime minister of South Vietnam, was a Catholic, and a lot of his cabinet and cronies were also Catholic. So a lot of the Vietnamese who came to the U.S. were Catholic, and that's why New Orleans was really attractive as a place. It was a very Catholic city. The archdiocese went there and said, come one, come all, would love to have you. So that's basically what I was just saying. This is a photo of a subsequent way. So in 1975, the departure was pretty civilized, where they went on airplanes, and I'm sure it was traumatic, but nothing like the subsequent waves of boat people that began in 1979, when about 1 million people decided that they didn't want to live in Vietnam anymore for a number of reasons. Roughly, 800,000, 900,000 of them came to the U.S., and that's the ones who made it. Nobody knows the death. The death rate was surely staggering. Nobody knows what it was. Best estimates seem to be your God was maybe 50 making it. If you got on a boat to try to go to the Philippines or Malaysia, or if you were overland, through Cambodia. So a lot of trauma in the population. And so New Orleans was one of the first places that was established in a very bustling, vibrant community in the area that I showed you. Heavily flooded, in Katrina. Everybody left. The whole city did. But then over the next year, the Vietnamese came back at levels much greater than others. So I'm going to briefly go through the conceptual framework, and then I'm going to wrap up with some of the findings and conclusions. So the basic paradigm that disaster researchers are using to try to figure out why some individuals and some groups not recover better than others is this resilience paradigm that I told you about before. They don't really include culture as part of it. And I'm thinking about it, that's fine with me, because I can't really think of a way that culture would directly affect recovery anyway. Religiosity, for example, if that's a dimension of culture, would have to affect maybe your social networks, within resilience, and that's how we affect recovery. And culture is kind of what I'm interested in anyway, so I'm fine that they don't include it. I'll just keep it in its own box out there. And then I'm also really interested in distinguishing what I think might be cultural and other aspects of advantages that the Vietnamese might enjoy that aren't cultural. So one of my points of departure on this is, I don't know if many of you have read Amy Chua's Tiger Mothers and Triple Packers and that sort of thing. My problem with that perspective is that I think she mixes up a lot of features that might be cultural, part of this kind of cultural package of beliefs that migrants might have with other advantages, like selection, for example, that I don't think that they do a very good job of incorporating. So that's what I mean by cultural confounders. There's a lot of other things going on that might give the Vietnamese a leg up that have nothing to do with culture, and I'm trying to tease those out. Okay. One point on the what I mean by culture. So culture has traditionally meant beliefs, values, and shared understandings. And beliefs and values have gotten a lot of attention because they're very integral to social surveys. You can put a belief in a survey and then sort of see whether Vietnamese or Guatemalans might differ on it. But that's not been a very fruitful area of research. And the explanation why seems to be that different groups value the same things, and we all want our kids to do better than us. We all value education, and there's just kind of not many things you can think of where groups are going to have very different values on it. And so lately, more recent scholarship by people like Jeffrey Alexander, Michelle Lamont, Swidler, those folks have really focused on the shared understanding part of how they might vary among groups. Hard to measure, but I think that they're right. There probably is kind of more bang for the buck there. That's where that's where I'm focusing my energies. This recent scholarship has talked about basically four different types or four different dimensions of these shared understanding. By narratives are these stories of how a group got here and what they're all about. And so they're repeated and shared, over and over again, kind of to solidify a sense of group identity. So these narratives, for example, will talk a lot about the move from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, surviving that, and how difficult it was, the post-1975 exodus to the U.S. and how difficult it was in surviving those sorts of things. Symbolic boundaries are just mechanisms that groups will use to kind of draw a circle around themselves and delineate between insiders and outsiders. Frames are perspectives, different ways that different groups will interpret the world based on their shared experience. And then these cultural toolkits, this is where there are, of course, these repertoires of behavior that will also vary by different groups depending on their experiences. Cultural encounters I've talked about. I'm going to go straight to the culture part so we can have some time for discussion. Sorry. I'm leaving my slides here, so I think if I can see that awesome. You're welcome to it. Okay, so let me give you an example of each one of those, just so you can see what I have in mind. And these are features. These explanations come from these qualitative interviews that I told you about. These long interviews after Katrina with community leaders about what went well, what didn't, and why. I'm working with a graduate student on it. I can tell you a little bit about intercoded reliability and how we went about that if you're interested. But let me give you some of the results on it so I can wrap up and we have time for questions and discussion. Okay, so one example of these narratives that comes across to me is really clear in these transcripts are these narratives of survival. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find the quote, but I think I can remember the gist of it. So these are stories that are shared, especially across generations, especially between parents and grandparents who spent time in Vietnam, to kind of express to their children about what being a Vietnamese American means. And one aspect of that is survival. So the quote that I'm not going to spend time digging out has to do with, we were asking one person, who was a psychiatrist, about he was talking about his father had a real high-level position in Vietnam when they came over. So is that very common? So I don't know anybody where it's not true. So you have all these doctors and lawyers and colonels who were real big shots and who came to the U.S. without kind of any contacts or any money, and they're all sweeping Burger King parking lots, but they move forward. They do that, save some money, send their kids to school, where they do really well. And so another narrative was this narrative of progress that is really closely related. So a lot of storytelling and a lot of examples of those sorts of narratives. So these frames, remember, are just perspectives on how the world works, are different kind of ways of interpreting the world that vary among groups. So remember my opening anecdote where I was talking about this interview that I had with the guy, who kind of had the same experience that I did, but he had a different frame. He was really looking at it with a completely different perspective. Not so much rose-colored glasses, I don't think, but his experience set him up to have really low expectations about what he could expect from government and other institutions. They're there to exploit us. Of course they're not going to come through. All that you can rely upon in that situation, I mean, it's a really cynical point of view, and I'm not advocating it, but I think it really does kind of, it's a different frame that kind of comes out of their own experience. They're very corrupt. Vietnam, where the last person you'd call in a crisis is a government official or police officer. Nobody in their right mind would do that. So that's an example of what I mean by strength. Symbolic boundaries, clear and setting distinctions between us and them. I've got some quotes, from some of the just Buddhist priests who was talking about these Vietnamese lessons that they were giving to try to give us have the children kind of grow up with a sense of their heritage, and other people make these really kind of funny but extreme comparisons between American children and Vietnamese children. They're not completely wrong. But things like Americans just can't control their mouths. They just talk all the time and can't be quiet. And the Vietnamese don't have that aspect. So that the truth of that or not aside, the fact that they're kind of buying into these distinctions between us and them, I think is also important. And the last one is, I'll wrap up, is one example in this cultural toolkit that I've got is this sense of adaptability. So one of the things that first drew me to Tulane was there was a really good book by Carl Bankston and Min Zhao called Growing Up American. Those of you who study immigration assimilation, I bet a lot of you have read it. And it's actually focused on the same Vietnamese community in New Orleans East. And so when I read it, I go, I would love to go to New Orleans and get to know more about that group. It's a really wonderful book. And one of their main conclusions, they were trying to explain why Vietnamese kids do so well, given that they're surrounded by a lot of urban problems, crime, drugs, truancy, and things like that were affecting a lot of the kids that lived in the schools and the neighborhoods nearby, but the Vietnamese didn't suffer so much from that. So their conclusion was that what was very protective of the Vietnamese kids were these traditional Vietnamese values and a lot of supervision done by parents. In our statistical data, we find some things that really correspond to that it turns out that we have this measure of acculturation that takes into account friends, language, and food. And so nobody was so you could be, you're on a continuum between American, very American or very Vietnamese. Nobody was very American. Everybody was either comfortable in both or very Vietnamese. It turned out that in 1 and 2 years after recovery, that if you were able to function well in both worlds, on those three dimensions, your recovery, your mental health status was a lot better. Those who were very Vietnamese, these were a lot of linguistically isolated people, who couldn't really deal with their contractors or FEMA or all those people that they were going to need these tools for. So it was the people who had this bicultural orientation that did the best. And so, I think this adaptation part is really important. So just like in Vietnam, they had this tradition of kind of taking this French architecture and using it for their own circumstances. And then also they would never be able to protest against something that was going against them in Vietnam. But in the U.S., they kind of figure out that there are some tools available for us that we can use as we adapt to American society. And so my kind of conclusion of this chapter is that perhaps the most important traditional Vietnamese attribute is an ability to adapt to new and changing circumstances. Just a couple caveats. Not everything's great. There's still some problems out there. These people who are culturally isolated, who are very Vietnamese and don't speak very good English, are not doing very well. Middle-aged men, are not doing very well statistically. The reason seems to be that all the worrying, especially in the first year or two, when the finances were all helter-skelter, they had the older parents, so they had to worry about the children, the jobs, everything. So they scored quite badly on some of their recovery measures. And this is a study of working age Vietnamese. So I don't have very much information about children and the elderly. They're of course very important. There's some community problems, that are also affecting the community. They're way out, in the corner of New Orleans East. New Orleans did not shrink the footprint. It covers a big area with a much smaller population. So fire protection is not great. Police response time is really slow. Getting roads and other utilities repaired, they're kind of at the bottom of everybody's list. So that part's not going well. But all in all, I think they are recovering in many ways a lot better than other groups that experience certainly have similar sets of challenges. I think a lot of the reason for this has to do with advantages that other groups didn't enjoy with these cultural confounders that I was talking about. But I also think that culture actually is part of the explanation for their recovery. And I've tried to operationalize that in a way that makes it a little bit less amorphous. And I conclude that these models of post-disaster recovery should actually incorporate a role for culture. Told you a little bit about the new wave of data collection. I've got this slide here if anybody wanted to read about it. There's a summary. And this is our, we send a New Year's card every year out to our respondents that we have an artist before. So this is the year of the monkey. This is the last one. Thanks so much for your attention.